and of course, the big question with all of this, every time we talk about this, we're trying to go from the esoteric to the pragmatic, and that is, what does all of this do? And there's a couple of interesting, one piece of research and one, I guess it's a blog or a memo from Amazon that point to sort of a good litmus test, right? So we talked a lot about the fact that one of the challenges with AI has been that it actually doesn't have a whole lot of use cases, or at least use cases with data to demonstrate its actual benefit and ROI. And one of the places that has gotten the most traction with AI, I suppose ironically enough, has actually been with developers. So we've seen a heavy adoption as sort of the killer use case of using it to improve developer productivity, or at least that was the thought. And this recent research that you found from, I think it's called Meter, is how they say their name,
Yes.
is, and this is hot off the presses, came out just a few days ago, a randomized trial, and you can walk us through the details of whatever you think is relevant. But the headline is that developers using AI saw their productivity fall by 19%, which of course is completely antithetical to what we should be seeing, which is productivity increasing. And so this is like a say what kind of moment.
Hmm.
And really, if it was, and they have all kinds of caveats. Like, it was hilarious actually watching. They have an entire table at the end of this saying, "Hey, we're not saying this doesn't mean nothing works. We're not saying this means that." It's like all these caveats in here, because it's like they clearly understand that this is a kind of a sensational finding of, hey, all this stuff is kind of BS. So, and then we're going to talk in a second about Amazon coming up with a completely opposite response to this. But first, what was your take, or anything that I didn't cover here as far as this particular study?
Yeah, so this meter task research was interesting because they took 16 developers, so it's not a huge sample size, but they were looking for basically case study-esque responses, and they found that the part I found most interesting here is that the developers ended up being 19% slower, which means from a practical perspective, going from 1 hour something minutes to about 2 hours. But they thought they were being 20% faster when they used AI. So it's kind of a weird juxtaposition here. They thought they were going faster. They were actually going significantly slower, probably because they were getting this wow factor from the AI giving them this stuff. And it's like wow, the AI just spit 20 lines of code at me. That's so amazing. But then, of course, you have to check the code yourself. And then you have to figure out how to fit it in to the larger code base or the program by yourself. And it turns out that as you go through all of these other steps, it ends up actually taking longer to do standard developer tasks that are AI guided. So maybe this is a good way to get rid of some introductory work, but for experienced developers, it is a slower process to work with AI.
Well, and I do think so. So I had a couple of interesting takes from this and looking at it. So they did identify the five likely contributors to
Mhm.
this scenario that they found after all their caveats. And one was, of course, the reliability of AI. And we've definitely been hearing more and more of this from developers, that they have to spend a ton of time going through and debugging the AI code, either for outright errors or also just for inefficiency and then optimizing it, right? And so
Mhm.
there's that. But I do think you pointed out the two big takeaways is that these developers, and this is the small sample size challenge, these developers were actually really good developers. They knew what they
Mhm.
were doing. They were very familiar with the repository they were working with. Um, and they came in with sort of optimistic estimations of what this was going to do. They were looking forward to this wow factor. Let's remember, all developers are technologists at heart. We're naturally optimistic about technology. We think we're excited about it. So you put those two combinations together, and AI is sort of set up to underperform around it, particularly in these large, complex environments that increases, the chances of AI just hitting stumbling blocks. So I think, there's a couple of interesting takeaways here. First is that the more experienced and expertise somebody is, in many ways, the less useful AI across, I would suspect, most domains is going to be. But to your point, those lower level activities, the things that are very rudimentary or routine or just sort of the monotonous work that has to be done across any domains, and this is where we're seeing AI being leveraged very effectively as sort of entry level type positions, it's actually very good at and is probably the most likely, most beneficial use case. So I think I think, there's some really good takeaways here. And one of those things where it's sort of common sense if you just sort of think about it. And then my last little observation is the motivation of why they did this to begin with. And this was they were rightfully, and we've seen recent studies also, we've been talking about this the last several weeks, around the same thing, that the benchmarks right now that these AI companies are relying on are flawed. And in
Yes.
this case, they're specifically saying when it comes to coding benchmarks, is that, quote, they sacrifice realism for scale and efficiency, that they are these self-contained little tests to see if they work, but they're not actually looking at it. And we've seen now this, we saw the Salesforce study, which showed that agents are struggling with real world complex workflows, yada, 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 right? We've
Right.
seen these sort of statements. And so again, the same thing, if you're a CIO, this is about picking your battles and aligning properly to where you're applying this technology, which leads us to probably, to me, the much more interesting data point. And this is a blog post that AWS put out. And they are claiming that they're seeing a 15.9% improvement in the use of AI within their developer experience. However, here's what's critical is they are not measuring the same thing. They are measuring something that they are calling CTS, which I'm hoping I can find, the cost to service, I think is what it
Cost of
stands
service.
for.
Yes.
Cost of service for software. Now, interesting, this is a metric that Amazon uses in their business overall, and AWS is applying it specifically in the context of their software deployments. But this is effectively taking the entire cost of everything it takes to deliver a product into the market and dividing it by the units of sale that the product is actually delivering. And that's what they're actually getting to this sort of measure. And by that measure, when they apply AI, looking across this entire supply chain, they're actually seeing a 15.9% improvement. And I love it because this is getting away from that abstract and getting down to a very pragmatic, real evaluation of where this applies. And this is where I think it comes down to what we were just saying. If you apply it properly in the right ways with intent, it can have a tremendous benefit.
Yes, the cost to serve is a common one in supply chain and software companies where you just take the holistic cost associated with bringing a service to market. And so Amazon decided to use this from a developer perspective to create this cost to serve for software. My concern with this measure is that the the dividend here is the number of software delivery units. And the number of software units doesn't necessarily translate to either the number of products or the amount of work done on behalf of end user customers. You could just be making more and more complex software that isn't noticeably better. And I'm sure Amazon would argue, well, somebody decided this was going to be better in the first place. That's why we created this unit and we made it. Um, but I am curious, and I don't think there's a great answer for this right now that we have access to as non-Amazonians. But I'm not sure whether units have equal value to either customers or clients or even internally. And I'd be really interested in seeing how that's measured.
Yeah, I mean, they do point to it a little bit in the article. I mean, I think it is, I think you're right. Unlike a product that I'm actually selling, where it is the ultimate customer that with their dollars are making that determination of value, they sort of admitted it. So in their article, they said that there's a chosen, what they call, I've never actually seen this term, socio-technical unit of work, which basically they're saying that means it's whatever the team deems valuable enough to review, merge, deploy, and support for customers. And if it's, so for microservices, they're saying it's a deployment. If it's a monolith or a mobile app, it's where it's a pull request. And I think it is the difficult part with software. It's like you have to sort of define what that is, and of course, engineers can potentially be self-serving with that. But I think my point in looking at this is, any metric is challenging, but I'm always much more likely to accept and believe a metric that takes a more holistic view of looking at an end-to-end life cycle.
Mhm.
There's always going to be flaws and there's always going to be chinks in the armor, but I feel like this is a much better representation. And I think the other thing that I'm looking at here is it's not looking at the use of AI in development solely from a coding perspective,
Mhm.
right? It's looking at across that entire supply chain. And I think that's critical because I think AI plays a role in a number of different domains related to software delivery. And looking at all of them, I think is really critical. So I think this is a good indication of what you can potentially get at. But hey, look, grain of salt. AWS it's in their best interest to put out a really positive number because they want other people to buy AI services, and that's how it goes. But
It is,
yeah,
but
I
this
felt
number
that.
is also smaller than some of the claims being made right now. There are software CEOs talking about 30 to
eh,
50% of all code being done by AI right now. And Amazon
who
saying
could you
it's
possibly be talking about?
yes. But Amazon's not saying 30%. They're saying 15% cheaper. I was like, to create stuff. And I think that's more in the realm of believability.
Yeah,
At least.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So I think it's good. I think AWS has become more of a marketing oriented machine recently, but they always sort of cut their teeth on this idea that they were first and foremost data driven. They were eating their own dog food. They were proving things out and then simply making it available to their customers. And I still tend to land with them on it that that's the approach they take. And so I look at this as a good sign, and as a good sort of benchmark of sorts to how you should be looking at this. And I think, I
Mhm.
mean, forget the numbers and forget even if you want the specific metric. I think the big takeaway, if I'm a CIO, is this is how you should be looking at it. You should be looking at your own end-to-end supply chain, what that pipeline, software delivery pipeline looks like. Look at how you can leverage AI across every dimension of it, and look at how you, whatever the appropriate measure is for you, how you are going to instrument that pipeline and then measure the impact that AI has over its totality. I think that's going to be the best metric because the only thing that in the end matters, these random benchmarks or the specific thing about looking at developer productivity, none of that really matters, right? The only thing that actually matters is AI materially improving your business going forward, and how can you substantiate that ideally in business terms that we can translate into dollars and cents and shareholder value. And I think at least Amazon's approach here gets us closer to that than these other much more esoteric abstract sort of views.
Mhm. Absolutely.